The sound of 12-year-old Carter Stone pouring his energy drink onto the polished boots of a decorated war veteran echoed across the marble steps of Arlington National Cemetery like a gunshot. In that single moment, captured by dozens of smartphones and broadcast live across social media, an entitled child from Connecticut learned that some lines should never be crossed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from hundreds of tourists who had just witnessed something that would change not only Carter's life, but spark a national conversation about respect, privilege, and the true meaning of strength. Welcome to my channel, where I share real stories with unexpected twists. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and give me a thumbs up. It really means a lot to me. Now, let's begin this story. Carter Stone had never heard the word no spoken with any real authority. At 12 years old, he was the product of helicopter parenting and unlimited wealth, raised in a world where problems dissolved with the swipe of a credit card and rules bent to accommodate his family's social status. His father, Preston Stone, had built a tech empire worth $200 million, while his mother, Sloane, dedicated herself to charity galas and country club committees that reinforced their position in Connecticut's elite social circles. On this humid July morning in Washington, D.C., the Stone family stood among crowds of tourists at Arlington National Cemetery, their designer clothes and expensive accessories marking them as wealthy visitors. Carter wore $700 sneakers and carried the latest iPhone, gifts that meant nothing to him because he had never wanted for anything. His platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. The family had come to D.C. for Preston's business meetings, with Sloane insisting they include some cultural activities for Carter's education. But Carter found history boring, monuments pointless, and the oppressive July heat unbearable. He had been complaining for the past hour about everything from the walking to the crowds to the lack of air conditioning. "This is so stupid," Carter announced loudly as they approached the tomb of the unknown soldier. "Why are we looking at some random grave? Can we just go back to the hotel and use the pool?" Sloane shushed him half-heartedly, while Preston remained absorbed in his phone, managing business deals even during their supposed family time. Other tourists glanced over with disapproving looks, but the Stones were accustomed to their son's outbursts and had long stopped trying to correct his behavior. It was easier to indulge him than deal with his tantrums. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and the crowd fell into respectful silence. The guards, members of the elite 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment known as the Old Guard, moved with precision and reverence that spoke to centuries of military tradition. These were not actors or performers, but active duty soldiers who had earned the honor of guarding America's most sacred military site. Leading the ceremony was Sergeant Owen Martinez, a 28-year-old veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before earning his position at Arlington. His chest bore ribbons that told stories of courage under fire, though visitors would never know the details of the battles he had fought or the friends he had lost. His movements were perfectly controlled, each step measured and deliberate, his expression focused on the solemn duty he performed every day. Carter watched the ceremony with growing irritation. He had expected something more exciting, more interactive, more entertaining. The solemnity bored him, and he began to fidget and complain more loudly, his voice carrying across the normally silent crowd. "This is lame," he said, his tone rising above the respectful quiet. "They're just walking around. What's the point? It's not like anyone's actually buried here anyway." Several tourists turned to stare at the boy, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to outrage. An elderly couple, both wearing veteran pins on their shirts, shook their heads sadly, while a family with young children moved away from the disruption. But Carter was just getting started. Emboldened by what he perceived as his family's status and wealth, he began treating the ceremony like his personal entertainment. He started making faces at the guards, trying to get them to break their stoic composure. When that failed, he began making loud comments about their uniforms, their synchronized movements, and what he called their robot marching. Sergeant Martinez noticed the disturbance, but remained professional. His training had prepared him for difficult visitors, and his duty required maintaining perfect composure unless there was a direct threat. The boy was disruptive, but not dangerous, and Martinez trusted that cemetery security would handle the situation if it escalated further. However, Carter's behavior was about to cross a line that would change everything. Frustrated by the guards' lack of response and feeling ignored, he decided to escalate his actions. He began moving closer to the barriers that separated tourists from the ceremonial area, his parents either not noticing or not caring about his movements as they remained absorbed in their own affairs. "I bet they can't even hear us with those stupid hats," Carter announced to no one in particular. "They're probably not even real soldiers, just actors pretending to be tough." The crowd's discomfort was now palpable. Parents pulled their own children closer, and several people began recording with their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the air was building, but Preston and Sloan remained oblivious, too caught up in their privileged bubble to notice their son's escalating behavior. What happened next would transform Carter's understanding of respect, consequence, and what it truly means to serve something greater than yourself. In a moment of supreme entitlement, he would cross a line that no amount of money or influence could uncross, setting in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about his place in the world. Sometimes the most privileged among us need the hardest lessons to learn. Carter's next action would transform a minor disruption into an international incident. Seeking the ultimate reaction and convinced that his family's wealth made him untouchable, he committed an act that crossed every boundary of respect and decency. He climbed over the rope barrier, ignoring the collective gasp from the crowd, and walked directly toward Sergeant Martinez. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body tensed with alertness. Years of combat training had taught him to assess threats while maintaining his ceremonial posture, and this situation was unprecedented in his 3 years of duty at Arlington. Standing inches from the sergeant, Carter looked up at the towering figure in his crisp dress uniform and made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what his entitled mind could comprehend. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his energy drink, the same 1,000-calorie beverage his mother packed for him every day without question. "Let's see if you're really a statue," Carter said with a smirk, and poured the entire contents over Sergeant Martinez's polished boots. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Phones came out as people began recording frantically, sensing they were witnessing something that would soon be viral. The sticky liquid pooled around the sergeant's feet, staining the pristine marble and creating a scene of disrespect that cut through the sacred atmosphere like a knife. For a moment that felt like eternity, Sergeant Martinez remained motionless. Years of military discipline warred with his human instincts as he processed what had just happened. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had carried wounded comrades to safety, had served his country with honor in the most dangerous places on earth. But this spoiled child had just committed an act of disrespect that went beyond mere rudeness. It was an assault on everything the uniform represented. Carter stood there with a satisfied expression, expecting either laughter or applause for his cleverness. Instead, he found himself staring up at a man whose eyes had suddenly become very, very focused on him. The ceremony had stopped completely, with other guards maintaining their positions, but their attention now divided between their duties and the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Cemetery security began moving through the crowd, but they were still navigating through the dense pack of horrified tourists. The silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation and disgust, as Carter remained oblivious to the gravity of what he had done. The moment lasted exactly 5 seconds before Sergeant Martinez acted. His response was swift, decisive, and perfectly within his authority as a federal law enforcement officer. Without breaking his rigid posture, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of military command across combat zones. "Step back immediately," he ordered, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. The tone was not raised, but it carried such authority that several tourists instinctively moved backward. This was not the voice of a ceremonial guard. This was the voice of a combat veteran who had commanded respect on battlefields around the world. Carter, however, had never heard anyone speak to him with such direct authority. In his sheltered world of privilege, adults either coddled him or simply gave him what he wanted to avoid confrontation. This command confused him more than frightened him, and he held his ground, his smirk wavering but not disappearing. "Or what?" he challenged, his voice cracking slightly. "You can't touch me. My dad has lawyers." The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Several people began backing away further, recognizing that the situation was about to explode. An elderly veteran in the crowd shook his head sadly, his own military service making him acutely aware of the profound disrespect being shown to a fellow serviceman. Inspector Luna Ramirez, head of Arlington Cemetery Security, was now pushing through the crowd while speaking rapidly into her radio. She had 20 years of law enforcement experience and immediately recognized this as a situation that could have serious diplomatic implications if not handled properly. Sergeant Martinez's training kicked in with military precision. "Young man," he said, his voice now carrying the tone he had used with new recruits who needed to learn respect the hard way. "You have just assaulted a federal officer on federal property. You have disrupted a sacred ceremony honoring America's war dead. You will step back now, or you will be detained." Carter's parents finally looked up from their phones, alerted by the commotion around them. Sloane gasped when she saw her son standing inside the barrier, facing down a guard whose imposing presence suddenly seemed very real and very threatening. Preston's face reddened as he realized they had become the center of attention, and not in a good way. "Carter!" Sloane called out, her voice high with panic. "Come back here right now!" But Carter was past listening to his parents. The confrontation had awakened something in him, a need to win, to prove that his family's wealth and status meant something. He had never been truly challenged before, and his response was to double down on his behavior. "This whole place is stupid," Carter announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You work for us, basically. We pay taxes, so you work for us." The reaction was immediate and visceral. American tourists looked genuinely offended, while international visitors seemed embarrassed to be witnessing such a display. Several people began recording more actively, sensing that they were witnessing something that would soon dominate social media. Sergeant Martinez's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He had faced armed enemies who had shown him more respect than this child. His fellow guards remained at their posts, but their attention was fully focused on the situation, ready to support their sergeant if needed. "Son," Martinez said, the word carrying no warmth, "your father's money means nothing here. You are on hallowed ground, and you have just desecrated it. Your nationality will not protect you from the consequences of your actions." Inspector Ramirez finally reached the scene, her radio crackling with updates from other security personnel throughout the cemetery. She was a veteran of countless difficult situations, from terrorist threats to diplomatic incidents, and she immediately understood that this seemingly minor disruption could have major implications. "Excuse me," she said, her voice professional but firm as she addressed the Stone family. "I need to speak with you about your son's behavior. This is a very serious matter." Preston straightened up, his businessman's instincts kicking in. He was accustomed to problems that could be solved with money or influence, and he approached this situation with the same mindset. "Look, I'm sure we can work this out," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Maybe we can make a donation to the cemetery or something. Kids will be kids, right?" Inspector Ramirez's expression hardened. "Sir, your son has just committed assault on a federal officer and desecrated a national shrine. This is not a matter that can be resolved with a donation." Meanwhile, the incident was being broadcast live across multiple social media platforms. The hashtag entitled Kid vs. Veteran was already trending, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Within minutes, millions of people would see Carter's act of disrespect, and the court of public opinion would deliver its swift and harsh verdict. The hardest problems are often the ones we create ourselves. What happened next would shatter Carter's privileged worldview completely. As his parents scrambled to contain the situation with increasingly desperate offers of money and influence, federal authorities arrived on scene with the serious bearing of people who understood the gravity of what had occurred. Special Agent Harrison Brooks from the U.S. Park Police stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding respect from everyone present. Behind him came Dr. Vera Coleman, a child psychologist who specialized in working with privileged youth who had gotten into serious legal trouble. "Mr. and Mrs. Stone," Agent Brooks said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "Your son has committed assault on a federal officer, desecration of a national monument, and disruption of a sacred military ceremony. These are felony charges that will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Preston's face went white. As a businessman, he understood the difference between local authorities, who might be influenced and federal agents who could not be bought. "He's just a child," he protested, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Mr. Stone," Agent Brooks replied evenly, "age does not excuse federal crimes. Your son's actions have been recorded by dozens of witnesses and broadcast live to millions of people. This is now an international incident." The social media explosion had indeed reached global proportions. The video of Carter pouring his drink on the veteran's boots was being shared thousands of times per minute, with overwhelmingly negative reactions. Comments poured in from military families, veterans organizations, and ordinary citizens expressing outrage at the display of entitlement and disrespect. Carter looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time in his life, saw universal disapproval. These were not the indulgent smiles of his parents' friends, or the paid politeness of service workers. These were the faces of people who were genuinely disgusted by his behavior. "I want to go home," Carter said suddenly, his voice much smaller than before. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate his entitled worldview. "I don't want to be here anymore." "I'm afraid that's not possible right now," Dr. Coleman said firmly but kindly. "There are serious legal procedures that must be followed. Your actions have consequences, Carter, and running away from them is not an option." A new figure appeared on the scene. Victor Wang, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran who had been visiting his fallen comrades' graves when the incident occurred. His weathered face showed both sadness and determination as he approached the group. "Agent Brooks," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "If I may, I'd like to speak with the boy." Carter looked up at the elderly man with confusion and fear. Victor's presence was different from the others, not threatening, but carrying a weight of experience that commanded attention. "Son," Victor said quietly, "do you know what this place represents?" Carter shrugged, his earlier defiance replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Dead soldiers, I guess." Victor nodded slowly. "That's right, dead soldiers. Boys not much older than you, who gave their lives so you could grow up free and safe. I was 19 when I fought in Korea. I watched my best friend die on a frozen hillside, protecting people he had never met." Carter's eyes widened. This was not another lecture about respect. This was real experience, real sacrifice, told by someone who had lived it. "That guard you disrespected," Victor continued, "he served in Afghanistan. He's seen things, lost friends, made sacrifices that your privileged life has never required. When you poured that drink on his boots, you didn't just disrespect him. You disrespected every person who ever wore that uniform." For the first time, Carter began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. This was not about rules or authority. It was about honor, sacrifice, and respect for those who had given everything for others. Dr. Coleman stepped forward. "Carter, the court has several options for how to handle your case. You could face juvenile detention, hefty fines, and a permanent criminal record. However, there is an alternative program designed specifically for young people like you who need to learn about service and respect." "What kind of program?" Sloan asked nervously. "Community service," Dr. Coleman replied. 6 months working with veterans organizations, learning about military history and sacrifice. It's intensive, humbling, and designed to teach the values that Carter clearly lacks. Carter's first instinct was to refuse, to demand his parents fight the charges. But something in Victor's eyes, something in Sergeant Martinez's steady gaze, and something in his own growing understanding of what he had done made him pause. Agent Brooks consulted his files. Given the international attention this case has received, and the potential for this to become a teaching moment about respect and consequences, the federal prosecutor is willing to consider the alternative sentencing option, but only if Carter demonstrates genuine commitment to change. The weight of decision fell on Carter's shoulders. He could continue fighting, continue believing his family's money made him untouchable, and face serious criminal charges. Or he could admit he was wrong and accept help to become a better person. Carter looked around at the faces watching him, the disappointed tourists, the stern federal agents, the patient Dr. Coleman, and the wise eyes of Victor Wang. For the first time in his privileged life, he was truly seeing other people as individuals rather than obstacles to his desires. "I'll do the program," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to understand what I did wrong." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before many had witnessed something remarkable. A moment when entitlement gave way to humility, when privilege accepted accountability, when a spoiled child took his first step toward becoming a decent human being. 6 months later, Carter would look back on this moment as the beginning of his real education. But first, he had to walk through the long, difficult process of earning back the respect he had so carelessly thrown away. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what matters. 6 months later, Carter Stone stood in the same spot at Arlington National Cemetery, but everything about him had changed. Gone were the designer clothes and entitled posture, replaced by simple khakis, a collared shirt, and a bearing that spoke of genuine respect rather than enforced compliance. In his hands, he carried a wreath of white flowers, purchased with money he had earned through his own work. The transformation had not been easy or quick. Dr. Coleman's program had required Carter to spend 40 hours per week working with veterans organizations, listening to stories of service and sacrifice, and performing the unglamorous but necessary work of maintaining veterans' facilities. He had cleaned bathrooms, served meals, organized supply closets, and gradually learned that true strength came not from privilege, but from serving something greater than yourself. The first month had been the hardest. Carter had resisted, complained, and tried to use his family's influence to reduce his obligations. But Dr. Coleman had been firm, and the veterans he worked with had been patient but unwavering in their expectations. Slowly, painfully, his entitled worldview began to crack and reshape itself. Victor Wang had become his most important teacher. The elderly veteran visited Carter's community service sites regularly, sharing stories not just of combat, but of the bonds formed between soldiers, the responsibility of leadership, and the true meaning of sacrifice. Through Victor's eyes, Carter began to see military service not as a job, but as a calling to protect others at the cost of personal comfort and safety. Real strength, Victor had told him one afternoon as they organized donated supplies for homeless veterans, is not about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to help others. Carter had also met other young veterans, men and women only slightly older than him, who had already served their country in dangerous places. Their humility and dedication stood in stark contrast to his former arrogance, and their acceptance of him despite his past behavior taught him about forgiveness and second chances. The social media attention that had initially humiliated him eventually became a platform for education. With Dr. Coleman's guidance, Carter began sharing his journey on his social media accounts, documenting his community service and the lessons he was learning. The response was mixed, but increasingly positive, as people saw genuine change rather than forced compliance. His parents, too, had been transformed by the experience. Preston and Sloan were forced to confront their role in creating Carter's entitled behavior and committed to raising him with different values going forward. They established a family foundation focused on supporting veterans' causes and began volunteering their own time rather than simply writing checks. Now, on this crisp December morning, Carter approached the tomb of the unknown soldier with the reverence he should have shown months earlier. The ceremony was the same. The guards moved with the same precision, but Carter's understanding of what he was witnessing had been completely transformed. Sergeant Martinez was still on duty, and when the ceremony concluded, Carter approached him with nervous respect. "Sergeant Martinez," Carter said, his voice steady despite his emotions, "I want to apologize again for what I did. I know I can never undo it, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what your service means." Martinez looked at the boy who had once poured a drink on his boots and saw someone completely different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility and respect. "Carter," the sergeant said, "I've been following your community service work. The veterans you've been helping speak very highly of your dedication and growth. That means more to me than any apology." Carter nodded, then walked to the tomb of the unknown soldier and placed his wreath among the others. As he stood in silent reflection, he thought about all the young men and women who had given their lives for others, and about his own responsibility to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. A year later, Carter enrolled in a military boarding school, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to continue learning about leadership, service, and discipline. His transformation from entitled child to respectful young adult became a case study in youth rehabilitation programs across the country. The broken phone from that day at Arlington was never replaced, but what grew in its place was infinitely more valuable: wisdom, humility, and a deep respect for those who serve others. Carter learned that true privilege is not about having power over others, but about using whatever advantages you have been given to make the world better for everyone. Victor Wang, who became like a grandfather to Carter, often reminded him that character is not about avoiding mistakes, but about how you respond when you make them. Carter's response, accepting responsibility, doing the hard work of change, and dedicating himself to service, transformed a moment of shame into a foundation for a meaningful life. The story spread far beyond that July day at Arlington. It became a reminder that respect must be earned and maintained, that privilege comes with responsibility, and that it's never too late to choose growth over entitlement. Most importantly, it showed that true strength is not measured by what you can take from others, but by what you are willing to give. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your perspective on life? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how challenges became opportunities for growth in your own journey. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, remember that real character is built not in moments of comfort, but in how we respond when life demands that we become better than we were.